Welcome to Creepy Enigma. Just find a comfortable spot, place your phone to the side, and let your mind drift. Like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now, close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the story take you into the shadows. About 3 years ago, I came down with a case of bacterial meningitis. I live in South Florida, and to my knowledge, there wasn't any kind of outbreak going on at the time, so I have no clue how I caught it or who I might have gotten it from. It started with severe symptoms, pounding headaches, disorientation, extreme fatigue, nausea, and zero appetite, but things really took a turn when I started hallucinating. That's when I realized this wasn't just a typical illness. While I was homesick in bed and my husband was at work, I distinctly heard a child's voice from downstairs calling out, "Mom, the thing is, we don't have any kids." I dragged myself out of bed and leaned over the railing to call out for my husband, but of course there was no answer. He was at work. Just standing upright made the pain in my head unbearable, so I crawled back into bed. Then I heard it again, a voice this time saying, "Hello," from downstairs. That's when I grabbed my phone and called my husband, panicking. I was freaking out, telling him I was hearing a kid's voice in the house, and I thought I was hallucinating. He could tell I was in bad shape, so he left work and came straight home to take me to the ER. While I was waiting for him to get there, I tried to change out of my pajamas. I had to rush to the bathroom in the middle of changing to throw up. While I was hunched over vomiting, I heard another voice outside the bathroom door. I couldn't make out what it said, and I wasn't sure if it was the same voice I heard earlier. I honestly thought I was losing my grip on reality. I didn't get a formal diagnosis until I arrived at the hospital, but apparently the condition was pretty serious. The doctors explained that if bacterial meningitis isn't treated quickly, it can lead to long-term damage or even be fatal. One of the doctors noted that hallucinations weren't a common symptom, but they weren't unheard of either. They started me on IV antibiotics right away. One doctor said I was lucky to have gotten there. When I did, waiting much longer could have had devastating consequences. My husband stayed with me in the room for a few hours. I was told I'd need to be hospitalized for several days to a week, given how advanced my symptoms were. Around 10 p.m., he had to leave to get some rest before work the next morning. Before he left, a nurse reminded me to call her if I needed anything. Despite feeling absolutely horrible, I managed to doze off not long after. That's when I had this dream, or at least I thought it was a dream. In it, my ex-husband was standing next to my hospital bed, looking down at me and talking. He was saying cruel, spiteful things about my current husband. Then he gently patted my head and told me he was glad I was okay, and that he came to check on me as soon as my husband had left. He started rambling about how much he despised my current husband and wanted him dead. The whole time he was stroking my forehead, and then he simply walked out of the room. To be honest, I've had disturbing dreams about my ex before, mostly because our relationship was deeply unhealthy and abusive, which I won't get into here. So when I woke up in this foggy, half-conscious state, I didn't immediately question it. But something felt off. I looked around the dim room and noticed a chair had been pulled right up to my bedside. No one was sitting in it. I was almost certain it hadn't been there when my husband left. Still, it was the middle of the night, and I felt too weak to think clearly, so I went back to sleep. The next morning, a nurse came in to check on me. I mentioned the vivid dream I'd had about my ex visiting me during the night. Her face changed a little, and she said, "That wasn't a dream. Your cousin David stopped by late last night." I told her I didn't have any cousins living anywhere nearby, let alone someone named David who'd visit me at the hospital. She looked more serious and replied, "Well, someone who introduced himself as your cousin David was here around midnight. My ex-husband's name is David." That's when I explained the situation to her more clearly, and she went to get a doctor. The doctor said it was possible that the antibiotics had caused a state of delirium, making it difficult for me to distinguish dreams from waking reality. That might have explained why what I dreamed about seemed so real, down to the details of what David had said. I called my husband to tell him about what happened. Naturally, he was furious and worried. He came back to visit that same evening after work. Earlier that day, though, I had texted David directly asking him what he thought he was doing, showing up at the hospital, and how he even found out I was there. He didn't reply at first, even though I saw that the message was delivered. So I followed up with another message, telling him that I'd heard every word he said to me in the hospital, including the threats about my husband, and warned him that I'd contact the police. A few minutes later, he finally responded, "I didn't threaten anyone. I only stopped by after hearing you were sick to make sure you were okay. You must have misheard something while you were sleeping." I replied, "Stay out of my life, or I'll get the police involved." He never texted back after that. I never ended up telling my husband about the threats I supposedly heard while I was half asleep. I wasn't sure if it had actually happened, or if it was all just a fever-induced delusion. With everything going on, especially the hallucinations from the day before, I honestly couldn't be certain what was real anymore. But I can't help but wonder if I really did hear those things. Maybe I'll never know. I got discharged from the hospital the following week. Around that time, I had matched with this girl on Tinder named Francesca. We're still friends, actually. She gave off a chill vibe. From the start, she had a full sleeve of tattoos on her left arm, streaks of red in her hair, and her profile mentioned how much she enjoyed working out. One of her photos showed her standing on the rooftop of a building with a killer view. I asked her where the photo was taken, and she told me it was from an old abandoned hospital just outside the city, she said. It was a popular spot to explore after dark and super easy to sneak into. Apparently there was usually just one cop doing rounds in the lot to keep people out, but she claimed avoiding him was simple. Francesca suggested we go there together for our first hangout date. Might be a stretch, but it was something like that. I was into the idea. It was different. Sounded fun, and she seemed cool, way more exciting than just grabbing a drink. I picked her up from her place, which was only 10 minutes from mine, and then we drove about 20 more minutes to get to the place. That drive gave us a bit of time to chat and break the ice. When we arrived, she had me park on this dead-end street that was shielded by tall shrubs. From there, it was just a short walk to the building. We hopped a small barrier that divided the street from the hospital's lot and jogged across the open asphalt toward the grass. By the entrance she said she always used. She guided us to a busted basement window. It looked sketchy, but I knew what I'd signed up for. Thankfully, I wore beat-up jeans like she suggested, since I figured I'd snag them on something at some point. We were using just our phone flashlights, no fancy gear. Francesca seemed to know her way around the place like she'd been there a dozen times. She led us to the stairwell that took us to the upper floors. Being alone with one other person in a huge empty place like that at night, it was creepy, and I had no idea it was about to get a whole lot scarier. We made it to the first floor, and Francesca was talking way louder than I was comfortable with. I kept thinking someone might hear us. Down the hallway, it sounded like a door creaked open or shut. It echoed right toward us. She stopped talking and went silent. I whispered, "Do people usually come here?" She replied quietly, "Sometimes, but not often." We shut off our flashlights and stood still. Then another noise, a loud bang, closer this time. In the darkness we scrambled. I trailed behind her, barely able to keep up. We made it back to the stairwell and dashed up a few flights, switching our lights back on once we felt we had some distance. Once we reached a few levels higher, we slowed down a little and started talking again. Francesca said the cops never actually go inside, so it could have been other explorers, but she found it weird that we didn't see any other lights down that hallway. No regular person would walk around here without one. Then we heard more movement, footsteps echoing from the same stairwell we'd just come up. Someone was coming. We took off again. She insisted she knew the layout, so I followed her through the twisting hallways. I was seriously freaked out. Whoever was following us, I couldn't tell if it was law enforcement or someone even worse. Eventually, she led us to this small, open area, kind of like a rooftop, but not the topmost part of the building. We stopped there to catch our breath. The vibe had completely changed by now. Even Francesca, who seemed so confident before, was visibly uneasy. After a few minutes, we crawled through another broken window that led into the ceiling area of a larger room. She wanted us to walk across these long, narrow planks of wood that stretched over a 10-foot drop. Falling from that height would definitely hurt. I didn't want to chicken out, so I followed her carefully across. We reached this pillar, where one board ended and another began. We sat there with our legs hanging over the edge, trying to relax and chat. The place was pitch dark and spooky, but we thought we were alone, until we heard footsteps below. Knowing someone was already aware we were there, we switched our lights back on and aimed them downward. Standing beneath us, right at the base of the pillar, was a man, maybe in his 40s, wearing a black beanie, black jacket, and black sweatpants. He stared up at us smiling, and in a deep, unsettling voice said, "Come on down," waving us toward him. I asked, "Are you with the police?" He acted like he didn't even hear me, just repeated, "Come on down," still smiling. We both stood up, totally spooked, and started making our way back across the plank. I was even more afraid of falling now, because I had no idea what that guy would do if he got to us. As we crossed, we saw him quickly exit the room. Through a door, he was definitely trying to intercept us somewhere else. We ran. We had to get out, and we both knew it. As we made our way to the stairwell on the far side of the building, we heard a door bang open several floors above us, followed by footsteps pounding down the stairs. He was chasing us. We sprinted like our lives depended on it. Down flight after flight, we finally hit the ground floor and ran across to where we'd entered through the basement. We clambered through the broken window again. I went out second, and the whole time I was sure something or someone would grab my legs, but I think we lost him by then. We dashed across the lot back to my car, jumped inside, and locked the doors instantly. We sat there catching our breath. It felt like we just lived through a nightmare, but oddly surviving it together kind of brought us closer. We drove off and ended up stopping at a Wendy's nearby to grab food and try to calm down. We just talked in the car for about an hour. After that, I took her home. Francesca and I stayed in touch. We dated casually for a few months, but eventually just became good friends. Neither of us ever set foot in that hospital again. I've worked as a nurse in several medical centers and care facilities over the years. Before my current job, I was employed at a senior care hospital located about half an hour from my home. I'd already had experience with elderly patients, so stepping into that environment wasn't new to me. I had only been at this hospital for a few weeks when this happened. The experience I'm about to share occurred during my second to last shift there, and for good reason. That evening I was scheduled for the overnight shift and was running on almost no sleep. I had been assigned to the memory care unit where patients with Alzheimer's were treated. The residents in that section had quickly grown fond of me. I was a woman in my 20s, and I think my youth and energy gave them some comfort. Many of them were left to drift through their thoughts most of the day, and having someone physically present seemed to bring them back to the present moment at least briefly. That night I was attending to a few different patients, but one woman stood out more than the rest. Her name was Lena. It was the first night I'd been assigned to her room, and she kept telling me about voices she could hear, and a man in dark clothing who appeared in the corner of her room. The other lady in the room had asked for the curtain to be drawn between them earlier in the evening, so Lena would stop bothering her. That roommate rarely spoke, but would smile when I was around. She was quiet and often confused. My shift began around 9 p.m., and by 11 most of the patients had fallen asleep, all except Lena. Every time she rang for me, she'd seem terrified, whispering about the voices and the man in black who kept watching her. Honestly, it was starting to make me uneasy. I didn't doubt that she was seeing and hearing something in her mind. It was real, and I felt for her. It must have been frightening. I tried to comfort her the best I could, helping her calm down without disturbing the other patient, by turning on the TV or making too much noise. I sat by her side, held her hands, and encouraged her to breathe slowly and try to relax. I reminded her that she wasn't alone. I was nearby and ready to help at any time. Eventually, this seemed to soothe her. The next time I checked on her, she had finally drifted off to sleep. Once the patients were all resting, the night slowed to a crawl. Time seemed to stretch on forever. A little while later, I was in the supply room, organizing linens, when I heard a noise. The space was tiny and completely quiet, and the door had been shut, so any sound was immediately noticeable. I looked around but saw nothing and went back to restocking. That's when I suddenly felt a firm hand on my shoulder. I turned quickly, heart racing, but there was no one there. Absolutely no one in the room, and yet I knew what I felt it was like. Someone had actually grabbed me. I stepped into the hallway to see if another nurse was nearby, but the corridor was completely empty. Everything was still. I had no choice but to get back to my task. Once I finished loading the cart and turned to head out, I froze and collapsed to the floor in shock. Standing outside the door, staring in through the small window, was a man in a black outfit grinning. My scream was loud enough to wake up the entire unit. The figure disappeared from view almost immediately. Moments later, another nurse burst into the room to help me up. Clearly startled by the noise, still in a panic, I asked her if she had seen the man in black. She looked confused and replied, "What man? There's no one here. We checked the entire ward." Meanwhile, Lena had woken up. My screaming must have stirred her. When I entered her room, she was muttering again about the voices. She mentioned hearing someone scream, not realizing it had been me. I asked her to describe the man in black. I wanted to know if he had been smiling. She gave me a long, hard look, the most focused I'd seen her all day, and replied with the question, "How did you know?" Even though my heart was already pounding, her words made it skip another beat. Suddenly she started shouting, "Get me out of here, he's coming." The other nurses rushed in to calm her down. That night, I was moved to another section to work alongside a colleague. Eventually, I left early because I was too shaken up to continue. The following day, I messaged the head nurse and told her that my next shift would be my last. I didn't feel comfortable coming back after what had happened, and thankfully she responded with understanding. I've never been diagnosed with any psychological issues. I've never hallucinated before, and I know sleep deprivation can do strange things to the mind. But this felt like something else entirely. The sensation of a hand on my shoulder. The image of that grinning man behind the glass. And Lena, who had described the same thing. It was all too real, too coincidental. To this day, I think of it as one of those rare, unexplainable events. Something eerie and possibly supernatural, and I truly hope it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. This incident occurred when I was approximately 15 years old, around the year 2008. My guardians had gone out for the evening to a gaming establishment, leaving me and our canine companion Luna by ourselves at home. It was about 11 p.m. and I was occupied with online messaging and watching videos on a popular streaming site. As I was engrossed in my typing and conversations, I heard Luna yapping at something in the main living area. My initial thought was that my guardians had returned, so I simply waited. After about a minute of continuous barking without any sound of the entrance opening, I got up and walked into the living area to investigate. Luna was facing the large windows that overlooked our driveway, still vocalizing. I couldn't really discern anything outside because the exterior lights were off and it was exceptionally dark. I peered through the window and observed only one vehicle in our driveway, confirming my guardians hadn't yet arrived. I attributed Luna's behavior to perhaps hearing a neighbor's car door closing loudly, or a particularly boisterous vehicle passing by, as we resided on a major thoroughfare with frequent noise, even late at night. I returned to my online conversations, but over the next 5 minutes, I repeatedly felt as though I was hearing sounds emanating from various parts of our residence. Luna would cease barking and then resume at irregular intervals. I was just about to get up to reassure her when I could have sworn I detected a tap or a rustling sound at the main living room entrance. I rose and slowly made my way back into the living area to glance through the windows once more. Nothing. I was beginning to feel a bit anxious and was too apprehensive to peer through the security viewer, fearing a disturbing face might be staring back at me. I double-checked to confirm the entrance was secured and was about to leave the room when the distinct sound of knocking suddenly originated from the side entrance of the house. My heart pounded. I was unsure what to make of it. Had my guardians been locked out and were attempting to gain entry? Was someone trying to force their way in? Were there multiple individuals? I barely had time to process these thoughts when I heard the distinct sound of the doorknob from the lower level being manipulated, as if someone was attempting to open it. Our lower floor was essentially beneath the dwelling, with its entrance being quite concealed. To reach that particular access point, one had to circumnavigate the entire house, enter our backyard, and go beneath the outdoor deck. One would either need prior knowledge of that entrance's existence or be remarkably determined to find a way inside. Luna was whimpering and barking louder than ever, dashing from room to room, seemingly trying to pinpoint the perceived threat. It felt as though the entire dwelling was encircled. The noises from the lower level intensified, and it almost sounded as if whoever it was had managed to gain entry, because suddenly the noise ceased. My heart sank. I stopped breathing, standing frozen in the silence, merely awaiting the next sound. Then, with lightning speed, Luna shot down the stairs and began growling ferociously at whatever was down there. Luna was a gentle-natured black retriever who had never harmed a fly, but in that moment, I had never heard her sound more menacing. It felt like I was petrified in place for several minutes. Finally, my primal survival instinct activated when I realized Luna had stopped barking and growling. I called her back upstairs and secured the interior entrance that led to the lower level. I grabbed the landline telephone, as I didn't possess a mobile device yet, and rushed with Luna into the closet of my guardian's bedroom, where one of our firearms was kept. I sat there, armed and ready, on the verge of dialing emergency services when I suddenly heard the primary entrance open. Luna bolted out. I shouted "No!" after her, but then I heard the voices of my guardians. I ran into the living room to see them stroking Luna and looking at me with a bewildered expression. I spent the next several minutes recounting the terrifying events of the night to my guardians. My mother was aghast, and my father spent the subsequent hour meticulously searching every nook and cranny of the house, both inside and out, with his firearm in hand. We didn't discover anything, and I didn't sleep a wink that night. The following afternoon, there was a knock at the primary entrance. My heart immediately skipped a beat, and I instinctively darted into another room. My father opened the door to find my Uncle Arthur standing there with an envelope in his hand. Uncle Arthur was, to put it mildly, an unsettling individual. He consistently mistreated my aunt and behaved very strangely around the children and younger relatives at family gatherings. Nothing illegal as far as we knew, but he just had this peculiar aura about him. You knew to try and keep your distance while growing up. I always felt a sense of apprehension whenever he addressed me. I can't recall anything specific he might have said, but his overall demeanor was disquieting. Even adults who spent too much time in his presence admitted he made them uncomfortable. I participated in recreational sports, and his daughter, my cousin Clara, played in a league a few years below mine. I adore my cousin and always felt sympathy for her having such an odd father, so I would often offer her advice or assist her team with pitching and fielding techniques. My mother and I discreetly listened from another room and overheard Uncle Arthur say something like, "I attempted to stop by last night to drop it off, but no one was home." I couldn't hear much else, but shortly after, I heard my father slam the door shut. My mother and I peeked out and inquired what had transpired. My father, his face trembling with anger, stated that apparently Uncle Arthur had been the one making all the commotion around the house the previous night, trying to gain entry. He handed me the envelope, and I opened it to find a card with a gift certificate inside, thanking me for assisting his daughter with her sports lessons. A night of dread and panic, all caused by my peculiar uncle. My father had issued a warning to him during their conversation at our front door, and after that, we never truly spent time with him again. When I reflect on this account now, I am at least relieved that I discovered the identity of the person behind the incident. Otherwise, I might have spent years wondering if it had been burglars, a supernatural entity, or something else entirely. I am grateful Luna was there to protect me. She most certainly deterred him when he was attempting to enter through the lower level. But even so, I am still left with so many unanswered questions. What on earth was he thinking? Why did he feel compelled to deliver that card so late at night? Why didn't he grasp the implication that we weren't home when no one answered the primary entrance? Why wouldn't he attempt to call the house to ascertain if we were present? And worst of all, what would have transpired had he managed to get inside? I've always cherished solitude. Around 5 years ago, I relocated to a modest lodge in the peaceful countryside of northern Viridia, escaping the urban clamor. The dwelling is spacious, isolated, and surrounded by expansive woodlands stretching far beyond my land. The nearest inhabitant is many kilometers away, and the only sounds audible are the breeze rustling through the foliage and the occasional bird song in the distance. It's tranquil, and that's precisely how I prefer it. Angling is my passion. I spend most of my time by the lake, situated directly behind my abode. It's the quintessential sanctuary from everything. I don't mind being by myself. In fact, I relish it. The lodge features a generous veranda that offers a view of the forest. I often sit there, a chilled beverage in hand, watching the sun descend behind the trees and listening to the nocturnal melodies of the woods. It has consistently been serene until recently. It began approximately 2 weeks ago. I was on the veranda as usual, simply gazing into the deepening twilight when I detected something, a twig snapping in the distance. I didn't give it much thought. Perhaps a deer or a raccoon. The woods teem with wildlife, and I've grown accustomed to their sounds over the years. However, as the days progressed, the noises became more frequent. Initially, it was just that snapping twig or rustling leaves, things I assumed were merely animals. But then, one evening, I heard something distinct, a scratching sound. It emanated from the side of the lodge, somewhere near the spare sleeping chamber's window. It was faint, almost as if attempting to be inconspicuous. I rose from my chair, my pulse quickening slightly more than usual. I waited, but nothing further occurred. Probably just a squirrel, I rationalized to myself, but a sense of unease lingered. I decided to retreat indoors and secure the premises for the night. The following evening, I heard it again, the scratching. It wasn't confined to the side of the lodge anymore. Now it was closer. It sounded as though it was coming directly from outside the spare sleeping chamber window. I froze, listening intently, my composure beginning to fray. I couldn't explain it, but something felt amiss. I approached the window, drawing back the draperies slightly to observe what lay beyond. The moonlight illuminated the trees, casting elongated shadows across the yard. The wind was still, and everything appeared normal. No animal, no person. I shook my head, convincing myself that I was merely allowing my imagination to run wild. It was likely a branch brushing against the window, or perhaps the wind, I reasoned. There was nothing to fret about, and I retired to bed. The next night, the scratching returned. It wasn't solely scratching anymore, though. It sounded like gentle tapping, as if someone were tapping on the window, attempting to gain my attention. My heart skipped a beat, and I sprang from my bed. I seized a handheld lamp and crept through the dim corridor towards the spare sleeping chamber. When I reached the window, I directed the beam outwards. There was nothing there, no individual, no creature, just the familiar empty woods. Yet, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was not alone. I couldn't articulate it, but something was wrong. The air around me felt dense, heavy. I returned to bed, but sleep eluded me. Every minor sound seemed amplified, and every creak of the floorboards echoed as if someone were moving within the dwelling. I remained awake, listening, but eventually succumbed to sheer exhaustion. The nights continued, and the sounds persisted. I would hear them nightly, always the same: a tap, a scratch, sometimes even a faint murmur that seemed to originate from within the very walls. I attempted to disregard it, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. One night, I resolved to confront whatever was causing it. Perhaps it's just an animal, I thought. Maybe a raccoon or some other creature has found its way inside. I retrieved a pry bar from the shed outside, deeming it prudent to have something in case matters escalated. I proceeded to the spare sleeping chamber and carefully unlatched the door. The air inside felt stagnant, as if untouched for ages. I hadn't utilized the room in months. I swept the handheld lamp around the chamber, moving slowly, inspecting every corner. Beneath the sleeping cot, behind the cabinet, nothing. I stood there for a moment, feeling foolish. There was nothing. It was just the same old room, empty. But as I turned to depart, I noticed something. The wardrobe door was slightly ajar. I didn't recall leaving it that way. My stomach churned. I slowly approached and pulled open the door. Nothing was inside, but as I directed the handheld lamp into the back corner of the wardrobe, I observed something peculiar. A small piece of fabric caught on the edge of the wall. It was dark, tattered, almost like a fragment of a tire. My breath hitched in my throat. I've always considered myself a pretty rational person, not easily spooked. I'm a geology student, or I was at the time this happened, and I tend to look for logical explanations for things. But this one experience, this one still makes the hairs on my arm stand up when I think about it too much, even years later. It was during my sophomore year of college, fall break. Most students went home or on trips, but I'd picked up a house-sitting gig to make a bit of extra cash. It was for one of my professors, Dr. Albright, who taught art history. She was eccentric, to put it mildly, and her house matched her personality. It was this old two-story Victorian place, set back from a quiet road on the outskirts of town, with a thick patch of woods bordering the backyard, beautiful in a creepy, Gothic sort of way, filled with antiques, strange paintings, and artifacts she'd collected from who knows where. She was going to be in Europe for 10 days, and my job was just to water the plants, collect the mail, and generally make sure the place didn't burn down or get broken into. Seemed easy enough. The first couple of days were fine, almost boring. I got used to the house's noises, the creaks of the floorboards, the sighing of the wind in the eaves. Old houses talk, that's what my grandma used to say. I'd spend my days studying, reading, enjoying the quiet. I did sometimes get that vague feeling of being watched, especially in the long upstairs hallway lined with these unsettling portraits. But I just chalked it up to being alone in an unfamiliar, imposing house. It was the third night, I think, when things started to get weird. A storm was rolling in, one of those big autumn gales that rattles the windows and makes the trees outside sound like they're scratching to get in. The power had been flickering on and off all evening, and I was curled up on the ancient velvet couch in the living room, trying to read by the light of my phone and a couple of strategically placed candles, just in case. That's when I first heard it, a faint tapping sound. At first, I figured it was just a branch hitting one of the upstairs windows, whipped around by the wind. It was irregular, kind of soft. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my book. After a while, I got up to make some tea in the kitchen. As I passed through the dim living room, something on the ornate mantelpiece caught my eye. It was a small, antique music box, inlaid with mother of pearl, one of Dr. Albright's prized possessions. I distinctly remembered noticing it earlier that day, and it had been closed. Now, the lid was just slightly ajar, maybe a millimeter, not much, but enough for me to notice. I frowned. I didn't remember going near the mantelpiece or touching anything on it. Maybe the vibrations from the storm? I reached out and gently pushed the lid closed, feeling the little click as it latched. It was probably nothing, just me being jumpy. I went to the kitchen, and just as I was waiting for the kettle to boil, the lights flickered one last time, and then darkness. A complete power outage. I sighed. Of course, I found Dr. Albright's emergency flashlight in a drawer. Thankfully it worked, and lit a few more candles, placing them around the downstairs area. The house suddenly felt 10 times bigger, the shadows deeper and more menacing. The silence, apart from the howling wind outside, was absolute. And then the tapping started again. This time it was more distinct, clearer, and it was definitely coming from upstairs. It wasn't the random scrape of a branch. It was rhythmic. Tap, 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 tap. A pause, then again. My stomach did a little flip. That wasn't the wind. That was something else. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding ridiculously small and shaky. "Is anyone there?" Silence, just the wind and the rain lashing against the house. My heart was thumping. I told myself it was the old house settling, the storm making things shift. But it sounded so intentional. Reluctantly, I decided I had to check. I mean, what if someone had gotten in? Even though I was sure I'd locked all the doors. Holding the flashlight beam ahead of me like a weapon, I slowly started up the main staircase, each creak of the steps under my feet echoing in the oppressive silence. As I reached the upstairs landing, the tapping stopped. Just cut off. I swept the flashlight beam down the long, dark hallway. Empty. I checked the guest bedroom first, then the small bathroom. Nothing. My hand was shaking a little as I pushed open the door to Dr. Albright's study. This was the room that always felt the creepiest to me, crammed with books and more strange artifacts. In the center of the room was an old wooden rocking chair. Dr. Albright had specifically told me not to sit in it or even touch it, as it was a very old family heirloom and quite fragile. As my flashlight beam fell on it, I froze. The rocking chair was moving, just barely. A tiny, almost imperceptible sway, back and forth. After a really rough patch where my car decided to give up the ghost and my part-time gig at the bookstore dried up, I was desperate for any work that paid, and that's how I ended up as the night auditor at the Starlight Motel, a lonely speck of a place off a mostly forgotten highway, about 20 miles from the nearest town. It wasn't glamorous, mostly just checking in the rare late trucker or weary traveler, running the day's reports, and trying to stay awake with bad coffee and an even worse selection of ancient magazines in the tiny office behind the front desk. The owner, Mr. Henderson, was an old, gruff guy who only cared that the books balanced and no one burned the place down. He told me it was quiet, that I'd mostly have the place to myself, which sounded okay at the time. A bit of peace to maybe study or just think. The first few weeks were exactly that. Dead quiet. A couple of check-ins a night, if that. Then Mr. Silas started staying. He wasn't a regular in the trucker sense. He'd check in for 2 or 3 nights, always requesting room 107 if it was available, pay in cash, then disappear for a week, only to return. He was a tall, thin man, probably in his late 50s, always impeccably dressed in slightly old-fashioned suits, even at 3 in the morning. His demeanor was overly formal, his voice soft and precise, and he had this way of holding eye contact just a little too long that made me feel like a bug under a pin. He'd ask polite but oddly personal questions while I was processing his check-in. Things about my shift, if I found it lonely, what my plans were for the future. I'd give vague answers, trying to keep it professional, but he had a knack for making me feel cornered, even in the small, cluttered office. It started subtly, the weirdness. After his 2nd or 3rd stay, I found a perfectly pressed, but very dead, flower on the counter when I came in for my shift, right where he'd been standing. No note. The next time, it was a small, intricately folded piece of origami paper, blank. I threw them away, telling myself it was just an eccentric old guy. But a part of me felt observed. He seemed to know when I was busiest with the audit, or when I'd stepped into the back for a moment, because that's when these little offerings would appear. Then I started noticing things about room 107. Even when Mr. Silas was checked out, I'd sometimes hear faint sounds from that end of the L-shaped motel wing. A soft scraping, like furniture being moved very carefully, or what sounded like muffled talking, too indistinct to make out words. I'd do a walk around, check the locks. Everything would seem secure. Mr. Henderson had told me 107 had some quirky plumbing, so I tried to attribute the noises to that. I attempted to politely refuse one of the gifts once, a small, smooth riverstone he'd left. When he returned a week later, I tried to hand it back, saying, "Oh, Mr. Silas, I think you forgot this." He just stared at it in my palm with a look of profound disappointment, almost sadness, and said, "A trifle, my dear, for your solitude." Then he turned and walked to his room without another word, leaving me feeling like I'd committed some major social faux pas. The unease was a slow burn, building with each of his visits. One night, after he'd supposedly checked out earlier that day, I found the door to room 107 slightly ajar. My heart hammered. Protocol was to report it, not enter, but something compelled me. I pushed it open, calling out, "Housekeeping?" The room was dark, the curtains drawn. I flicked on the light. It was impeccably neat, almost sterile. The bed made with military precision. It didn't look like anyone had stayed there. But the air was cold, colder than the rest of the motel, and there was a faint, musty, almost metallic scent. I don't know why, but I opened the drawer of the bedside table. Inside, on top of the Gideon Bible, was a cheap notepad. Several pages had been torn out, but on the remaining top sheet was a crudely drawn, but recognizable sketch of the motel's front office layout, with a small circle drawn around the front desk chair where I sat every night. Underneath it, in neat block letters, was my first name. I slammed the drawer shut, my breath catching in my throat, and got out of there, making sure the door was locked. I wanted to tell Mr. Henderson, but what would I say? That a guest drew a map? He'd think I was crazy. Mr. Silas wasn't due back for days, according to his usual pattern. But he returned that very night, around 4 a.m., just as I was trying to calm my racing pulse. He appeared at the desk as if from nowhere, silent as a shadow. "A problem, my dear?" he asked, his eyes glittering in the dim office light, a small, knowing smile on his lips. He hadn't asked for room 107 this time, just stood there. I stammered something about a late checkout. He nodded slowly. "Some rooms," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "hold more interest than others. One must be careful what doors one opens." Then he simply turned and walked out into the pre-dawn gloom. He didn't check in. I was terrified. He knew. He somehow knew I'd been in that room. The next night, the power in the office flickered, died, then came back on a few seconds later. When it did, there was a new note on the counter, weighted down by a dead bird, a small sparrow. The note just said, "Curiosity." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely read it. I looked wildly around the parking lot, but saw no one. Later, as I was forcing myself to do a security walk, I saw him, Mr. Silas, standing at the far end of the unlit corridor of the 100 wing near room 107, just a silhouette against the faint light pollution, watching me, unmoving. That was it. I couldn't take another second. I grabbed my bag, locked the office as best I could, and called my friend from my cell in the parking lot, practically screaming for her to come get me. I told Mr. Henderson I was sick, that I quit. I never went back to the Starlight Motel, and I took a longer, less direct route to my new job for months, terrified I'd see Mr. Silas's car. Sometimes, when I'm working late at my new, much more normal job, and the lights flicker, or I see an older man in a suit, I still feel that chill, that feeling of being watched, of having stumbled too close to someone's dark, unsettling secrets in a place I should have never been. To make ends meet while I was trying to get through community college, I took a job as a night security guard. The company mostly did gigs for places that were either closing down or, like this one, under construction. This particular assignment was a new multi-story office building, basically just a concrete shell at that point, dark and echoing, right on the edge of an industrial park that was dead after 6 p.m. My duties were simple: patrol each floor once an hour, check the perimeter fence, log any incidents, and mostly just be a warm body to deter vandals. The first couple of weeks were mind-numbingly boring. Just me, my flashlight, and the wind whistling through the empty window frames. I'd listen to podcasts, try to read, anything to pass the hours until the day crew arrived. Then I started noticing little things. A stack of tools on the third floor would be slightly rearranged from how I remembered it. A roll of plastic sheeting on the fifth floor would be unfurled a bit. A door to a utility closet I knew I'd secured would be found ajar. I figured it was just the day guys being sloppy, forgetting to tidy up properly. I mentioned it in my logs, but nothing came of it. One night, about a month in, while I was doing my 2 a.m. patrol on the ground floor, I saw another flashlight beam sweeping across the far end of the vast, open space. My heart leaped into my throat. I was supposed to be the only one there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the huge area. A figure emerged from behind a stack of drywall. He was a tall guy, wearing a dark blue uniform that wasn't quite like mine, and he had a friendly, almost too eager smile. "Hey there," he said, his voice surprisingly loud. "Marcus, just doing some spot checks for Allied Security. Didn't mean to startle ya." "Allied?" My company was Titan Security. I'd never heard of Allied doing checks on our sites. His uniform had no company logo, just a generic security patch. "Didn't know anyone else was scheduled," I said, trying to sound casual. But my internal alarm bells were ringing. "Yeah, management likes to keep you guys on your toes," he said with a wink. "Mind if I walk with you for a bit? Gets lonely out here." I didn't like it, but what could I say? So Marcus started occasionally joining me on my patrols, always appearing out of nowhere. He asked a lot of questions, too many questions, about my route, the dead spots in radio coverage, where the emergency shutoffs were, how long it took for a supervisor to respond to a call. I gave him vague answers, but he was persistent. Soon, the small things being out of place escalated. My personal thermos, which I always left on the folding table in my makeshift office, a corner near the main generator, went missing. I found it a few hours later on the top floor, balanced precariously on a window ledge. Then one night, I started finding these weird symbols, chalked in out-of-the-way places, behind stacks of materials, inside unfinished elevator shafts. They weren't gang tags. They were more like crude, almost tribal-looking designs, and they always seemed to appear after Marcus had been around. I called my supervisor, a guy named Dave, and asked him about Allied Security or anyone named Marcus being authorized on site. Dave sounded annoyed. "What are you talking about? No one else is supposed to be there. If you see anyone, you call the cops, then me. Got it?" Now, I was genuinely scared. Marcus wasn't just some overly friendly guard from another company. He was something else. I tried to vary my patrol times, take different routes, but he still found me. One night, I deliberately went to a floor I hadn't told him I frequented and found fresh chalk symbols there, along with a half-eaten sandwich that looked suspiciously like the one I'd packed for my lunch but hadn't gotten to yet. The feeling of being constantly watched, of my space being invaded, was overwhelming. I started feeling like I was the one being patrolled, not the other way around. I knew I had to confront him, or at least try to get a better look at him, maybe even a photo for the police if it came to that. The next time he appeared, I tried to be more direct. "Marcus, what exactly is your role here?" My supervisor doesn't know anything about Allied security." He just smiled that wide, unsettling smile. Supervisors don't know everything, do they? Some of us work a little more discreetly, just making sure things are secure for the right people. His eyes were cold, despite the smile. I decided to try and follow him one night. He said he was going to check the west perimeter, so I gave him a few minutes and then quietly trailed after him. He moved through the dark, unfinished building with an eerie silence and speed that a man his size shouldn't have possessed. I lost him near the loading docks. As I was cautiously looking around, my flashlight beam fell on a small, alcove-like space hidden behind some stacked pallets. Inside, the walls were covered in those same chalk symbols, dozens of them, and in the middle, a crude, almost childlike drawing of a stick figure wearing a security guard uniform with an X drawn through its head. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't just weird, it felt actively malevolent. I backed out of there, my heart pounding. Later that shift, as I was on the 4th floor, the temporary lighting in my entire section suddenly went out, plunging me into pitch darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, and as the beam cut through the black, Marcus was standing there, not 10 feet away, his face unreadable. "Careful now," he said, his voice soft. "Wouldn't want you to trip and fall in the dark. Some people don't like it when you poke your nose where it doesn't belong." He then just turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as if he were made of them. The lights flickered back on a moment later. That was my breaking point. This wasn't just trespassing or petty vandalism anymore. It felt like a direct threat. I got on my radio and called Dave, my voice shaking, telling him someone was on site, had threatened me, and had sabotaged the lights. I told him I was heading to the main entrance and waiting, and if backup wasn't there in 10 minutes, I was calling the police directly and leaving. Dave actually sounded concerned this time. He and another supervisor were there in 15 minutes, along with a police car. We swept the building. There was no sign of Marcus. The chalk marks were still there, the drawing in the alcove, but he himself had vanished. I wrote up my report, showed them everything. I don't know if they believed the full extent of it, but they saw enough to know something was seriously wrong. I refused to go back to that site. They transferred me to a brightly lit, very public warehouse for the remainder of my time with tightened security. I still have no idea who or what Marcus was. A squatter, a saboteur, part of some weird cult. But every time I see an unfinished building at night, or find myself in a place that's too quiet, I get that same prickling sensation on my skin, that feeling that someone is watching from just beyond the reach of the light, someone who knows more about me than I do about them. I needed cash, fast, after my roommate skipped town leaving me with all the rent, so I took the first job I could find, night attendant at Spin City, a 24-hour laundromat on the dingy edge of downtown. It wasn't a glamorous job, mostly just making change, cleaning lint traps, wiping down machines, and trying to look busy when the owner, Sal, did his occasional late-night drive-by check-ins. The place had seen better decades. Half the fluorescent lights hummed and flickered. A few machines were perpetually out of order, and it always smelled faintly of damp concrete and forgotten socks. Most of the late-night clientele were shift workers, students, or just people who preferred doing their laundry when the world was asleep. And then there was Eliza. She started coming in about a week after I began. She was a thin, pale woman, maybe in her late 40s, though it was hard to tell. She always wore the same faded blue overcoat, regardless of the weather, and a knitted hat pulled down low over her brow. She never made eye contact, just shuffled in, always used the same 2 washing machines in the back corner, numbers 14 and 15, paid with exact change, and then sat on the cracked plastic bench, staring blankly ahead, while her clothes washed and dried. She never spoke a word. At first I just thought she was shy, or maybe a bit eccentric, harmless. But then the little things started. I'd find small, neatly folded items of clothing left near my small attendant's counter after she'd gone. A single child's sock, a man's handkerchief, a delicate lace collar that looked like it belonged to an antique doll. None of it looked like anything Eliza herself would wear. And they weren't items from the lost and found, I checked, when I'd try to give them to her on her next visit, saying, "Excuse me, I think you might have left this." She'd just look at the item with a completely blank expression, sometimes giving a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head, before turning back to her machines. The feeling of unease started to grow. Sometimes, after Eliza had loaded her machines and was sitting on her bench, I'd hear what sounded like soft humming, almost a lullaby, coming from the direction of her washers, even though she herself was silent. It was so faint I'd wonder if I was imagining it, or if it was just the thrum of the old machines playing tricks on my ears in the dead of night. The lights above machines 14 and 15 also started acting strangely whenever she was there, flickering more intensely than the others, sometimes dimming almost completely for a second or two. Then, other people's unclaimed laundry, items left in machines or in baskets, started disappearing. Not whole loads, just single, specific items. A bright red scarf, a man's work shirt, a child's brightly patterned pajama top. A day or two later, the missing item would reappear, not in the lost and found, but neatly folded on top of one of the dryers. Sometimes with one of those strange, out-of-place items Eliza left for me tucked inside it. I started watching Eliza more closely, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. One night after she'd left, a wave of curiosity mixed with a definite sense of dread got the better of me. I went over to machines 14 and 15. They were cold, empty, but as I leaned closer to number 14, I felt a distinct cold spot right in front of it, like an open freezer door, even though the laundromat itself was stuffy. And there was a smell, very faint, sweetish but also musty, like old perfume and damp earth. I opened the door to washer 15, which had an out-of-order sign Sal had taped on weeks ago, a machine Eliza often just stood near for a few moments before using her usual two. Tucked deep inside the drum, almost hidden, was a small, grimy, one-eyed teddy bear. It looked ancient. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just eccentricity anymore. I didn't know what it was, but it felt wrong, deeply wrong. The next night Eliza came in. She didn't go to her usual bench. After loading her machines, she walked slowly, deliberately, over to my counter. She stopped right in front of me and just stared. Her eyes, usually downcast, were wide and fixed on mine, and they looked incredibly old and sad. Then she leaned in, her breath smelling faintly of that same sweet, musty odor, and whispered, so low I could barely hear it, "They're waiting. They get so cold." Before I could react, she placed a folded piece of paper on the counter, turned, and shuffled out. I stared at the paper, my hand trembling as I reached for it. It was a child's drawing, crayon on cheap paper. It depicted a crude house and a stick figure family, a man, a woman, and two smaller figures. One of the smaller figures was violently scribbled over in black crayon, next to. The remaining family, another stick figure had been added, a crude approximation of me, right down to the blue smock Sal made me wear. Underneath it, the word "soon" was written in shaky letters. I felt sick. I ran to the front door, peering out into the dark, empty street. Eliza was gone. I turned back, and that's when I noticed the main glass door, the only way in or out, was now locked. Not from the inside latch, but as if someone had locked it with a key from the outside. I rattled it, panic rising. I was trapped. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two, I heard a click, and the door was suddenly unlocked again. I didn't wait to see who or what had done it. I grabbed my phone, my bag, and ran out of there, not even bothering to lock up. I called Sal from a block away, told him I was quitting, that I was sick. He grumbled but didn't ask too many questions. I never found out what Eliza's story was, or what was going on in that laundromat. Was she a ghost? Just a deeply disturbed woman caught in some terrible grief? And what about those clothes, the toy, the drawing? I try not to think about it. But sometimes, when I'm doing my own laundry now, in a bright, busy place in the middle of the day, I still feel a chill, and I can almost hear that soft, humming lullaby, and Eliza's whispered words. They're waiting. I always check the machines very carefully before I use them now. There was this park near my house when I was growing up. A pretty standard suburban park with a playground, a baseball field, and a few walking trails that wound through a small patch of woods. I spent a lot of time there, especially during the summers. In the middle of the largest open field, there was this one enormous ancient sycamore tree. It was huge, much older and bigger than any other tree in the park, and its branches spread out wide, offering a lot of shade. Kids used to play under it, and sometimes families would have picnics there. It was just a tree, a landmark. This particular summer, I was probably around 12. My friends and I were at that age where we were starting to feel a bit too old for the playground swings, but not quite old enough to have anything better to do. So, we often just hung out in the park, usually near that big sycamore. One afternoon, we were sitting under its shade, just talking and messing around. It was a hot day, and the shade was a relief. I remember leaning back against its trunk. The bark was rough and cool. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. After a while, my friends decided to go get ice cream from a van that usually parked by the park entrance. But I didn't have any money on me, so I said I'd just wait. So there I was, alone under the big sycamore. It was quiet, most people having either gone for ice cream or home for dinner. I closed my eyes for a bit, just enjoying the slight breeze. When I opened them, I noticed something I hadn't before. High up in the branches, almost hidden by the leaves, there looked to be something caught. It was hard to make out, just a dark shape. Curiosity got the better of me, so I stood up and walked around the base of the tree, trying to get a better angle. From a different spot, I could see it a bit more clearly. It looked like a piece of old, dark fabric, maybe a tattered piece of clothing, snagged on a high branch. It was really high up, too high for anyone to have easily climbed and left it there. I thought it was a bit strange, but figured a bird might have carried it, or the wind had blown it up there. I didn't think much more of it. My friends came back with their ice creams, and we moved on to other things, eventually heading home as it started to get dark. The next day, we were back at the park. Again, we ended up near the sycamore. While my friends were kicking a ball around, I found myself looking up at that branch again. The piece of fabric was still there, but this time it looked different. It seemed a bit larger, and the shape was less defined. I told myself it was probably just the way the wind had shifted it, or the light was different. Later that week, I was in the park alone, just killing time. I walked over to the sycamore almost without thinking. I looked up. The dark shape in the branches was definitely bigger now. It wasn't just a piece of fabric. It looked more like a bundle or something wrapped up. A cold, uneasy feeling started to creep over me. It still didn't make sense how it could have gotten up there, or why it seemed to be changing. I tried to tell my friends about it, but they just laughed it off. "It's probably just a squirrel's nest, or an old kite," one of them said. But I knew it wasn't. There was something about it that felt wrong. Over the next few days, I became almost obsessed with that thing in the tree. Every time I went to the park, I'd check on it. And every time, it seemed to have grown, to have taken on a more distinct yet still unidentifiable shape. It was dark, almost black, and it seemed to absorb the light around it. The unease I felt had grown into a knot of genuine fear in my stomach. I stopped sitting under the sycamore. I even started avoiding that part of the park. One evening, I was walking home from a friend's house, and my route took me past the edge of the park, It was getting dark, and the park was mostly empty. I told myself not to look, but I couldn't help it. My eyes were drawn to the sycamore, standing silhouetted against the twilight sky. And the thing in its branches was massive now. It was no longer just a bundle. It had a vaguely humanoid shape, slumped over the branch as if exhausted or waiting. I couldn't see any features, just a dark, hulking form. My heart hammered in my chest. I broke into a run and didn't stop until I was home, locking the door behind me. I didn't tell my parents. I knew they wouldn't believe me, or they'd just say I had an overactive imagination. I tried to convince myself of the same thing, but the image of that dark shape in the tree haunted me. A few days later, there was a big storm. Heavy rain, strong winds, the kind of storm that makes you glad to be inside. The next morning, the sun was out, and everything was clean and fresh. I had to go to the park to meet a friend. As I walked, I felt a strange sense of relief. Surely the storm would have dislodged whatever was in that tree. When I got to the field, I looked towards the sycamore. The branches were bare, except for the leaves. The dark shape was gone. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It must have just been an accumulation of debris, I told myself, blown away by the wind and rain. But as I got closer to the tree, I saw something at its base. Lying on the damp ground, partially covered by fallen leaves and twigs, was a large, dark, heavy-looking garbage bag. It was torn in a few places, and from one of the tiers, I could just make out the pale, unmistakable shape of what looked like a human hand. I didn't scream, I didn't even move. I just stood there, a cold dread washing over me. Then I turned and ran, faster than I ever had before, all the way home. I told my parents I felt sick and stayed in my room for the rest of the day. I never found out what happened after that. I never went back to that specific spot in the park. I don't know if anyone ever found that bag, or what was truly inside it. Sometimes I wonder if the thing in the tree was a warning, or if the tree itself was trying to show me something. Or maybe it was just a series of horrible coincidences. But even now, years later, when I see an old, sprawling sycamore tree, I can't help but look up into its branches, half expecting to see a dark, shapeless bundle caught among the leaves, waiting. And I always walk a little faster. This happened when I was around 9 years old, shortly after my family moved into an old farmhouse my parents had bought for a surprisingly low price. It was a fixer-upper, as they called it, which meant it was run down and needed a lot of work. The house itself was 2 stories, with a sprawling, damp cellar that my dad planned to convert into a workshop. The property also had several acres of overgrown land, mostly tangled woods, and an old, neglected orchard. The cellar was the creepiest part of the house. It was always cold, even in summer, and had a persistent earthy, musty smell. It was mostly unfinished. Stone walls, a low ceiling, and a packed dirt floor in some sections, concrete in others. There was one small, grimy window high up on one wall that let in a sliver of weak light. My brother and I were warned to stay out of there, because of loose wires and unstable shelving, but of course, that only made it more intriguing. One afternoon, while my parents were busy with some repairs upstairs, my older brother Mark, who was 13, dared me to go down into the cellar with him. We snuck down the creaky wooden stairs, armed with a single flickering flashlight. The cellar was filled with shadows and cobwebs, old tools, broken furniture, and boxes of forgotten belongings were piled everywhere. As we were exploring, Mark pointed the flashlight beam toward a far corner, one with a dirt floor. "Hey, look at that," he whispered. There, in the dim light, sprouting directly from the packed earth, was a tiny tree sapling. It was no more than a foot tall, with a few pale, delicate leaves. It looked completely out of place, like a fragile green shoot in a tomb. "That's weird," I said. "How did a tree start growing down here?" Mark shrugged. "Maybe a seed got in through that window." We didn't think much more of it at the time. It was just a strange little plant in a strange old cellar. We went back upstairs, a little spooked by the general atmosphere of the cellar, but not by the sapling itself. A few weeks went by. My dad started clearing out the cellar, moving boxes and old junk. One evening at dinner, he mentioned the sapling. "Found the oddest thing today," he said. "A little tree growing in the corner of the cellar. Pulled it right out." He chuckled. No idea how it got there. I felt a strange little pang of something. Disappointment? I wasn't sure why. It was just a weed, essentially. The next day, Mark and I, out of boredom, decided to go check out the cellar again, now that Dad had cleared some space. We went to the corner where the sapling had been. The dirt was disturbed, where Dad had pulled it, but then my flashlight beam caught something, just a few inches away from the original spot. There was another tiny green shoot. It looked identical to the first one, maybe even a tiny bit larger. "No way," Mark breathed. "Did Dad miss one?" "Or maybe," I said, a weird idea forming in my head. "It grew back." Mark scoffed. "Trees don't grow back that fast, genius." But over the next week, every time we secretly checked, that new sapling was noticeably taller. Its leaves were a little greener, a little stronger, and the earthy smell in that corner of the cellar seemed stronger too, almost fresher. One afternoon, we found my dad in the cellar, staring at the sapling, now almost 2 feet tall. He had a confused look on his face. "I swear I pulled this thing out last week," he muttered, more to himself than to us. He bent down, gripped its thin trunk, and pulled. It came out with a soft, ripping sound from the dirt. He tossed it onto a pile of debris. The next morning, I woke up with an odd feeling. I snuck down to the cellar before anyone else was awake. My heart was pounding. I shone the flashlight on the corner. There were now 2 saplings, both about a foot tall, standing side by side, their pale leaves almost glowing in the flashlight beam. And the air around them felt cold, colder than the rest of the cellar. I ran back upstairs, terrified. I didn't tell Mark or my parents. I didn't know how to explain it. I started having nightmares, dreams of a vast, dark forest growing beneath our house, its roots tangling around the foundations, its branches reaching up through the floorboards. I'd wake up sweating, the musty, earthy smell of the cellar seeming to cling to me. I avoided the cellar completely, but Mark, being older and braver, or so he thought, kept checking. He told me, his voice hushed and a little scared now, that every time Dad pulled them out, more would appear, and they were growing faster. He said the patch of dirt where they grew was always damp, even when the rest of the cellar floor was dry. One day, about a month after we first found the sapling, my dad went down to the cellar with a shovel and a can of weed killer. He was determined to get rid of them for good. Mark and I hovered at the top of the stairs, listening. We heard him digging, then a grunt, and then a strange, low, sighing sound that didn't sound like my dad. It seemed to come from the cellar itself. Then my dad yelled, a short, sharp cry of pain or surprise. "Dad!" Mark shouted, and we both scrambled down the stairs. My dad was standing in the corner, pale-faced, looking at his hand. There was a thin, shallow cut across his palm, bleeding slightly. The shovel was on the ground. The patch of dirt looked torn up, but there were no saplings visible. "What happened?" I asked. "Slipped with the shovel," he said, but his eyes kept darting around the corner, as if he expected something to jump out. "These damn things, their roots are like iron. Pulled out a whole mess of them." He sprayed the weed killer liberally over the disturbed earth. That should do it, but it didn't. The next morning, The saplings were back, not 2 or 3, but a small, dense cluster of them, already a foot high, and they looked stronger. Their leaves were a darker green. The earthy smell was overwhelming, and the cut on my dad's hand, he told my mom, was throbbing painfully and looked a little inflamed. My parents were genuinely unnerved now. They decided to call a professional, someone who dealt with problematic vegetation, as my mom put it. While they were waiting for the specialist to arrive, something even stranger happened. The floorboards in the living room, directly above that corner of the cellar, started to creak and bulge slightly upwards. Tiny, hair-like roots began to push their way through the seams between the boards. They were pale and searching. The specialist came, a quiet old man with knowing eyes. He took one look at the cellar, at the cluster of saplings, which had grown even more, and at the roots in the living room. He didn't say much. He just shook his head and told my parents, "You need to leave this house. Some trees don't like to be disturbed, and this one is deep." He refused to do any work, said it was beyond him, and left. That night, my parents boarded up the cellar door. We slept in their room, all of us together. The creaking from the living room floor was louder, and the earthy smell had permeated the whole house. I dreamt of walking through an endless, dark forest, the ground soft and yielding beneath my feet, and the feeling of countless roots brushing against my ankles. The next morning, my dad didn't even hesitate. We packed a few bags, got in the car, and drove away. We never went back to that farmhouse. My parents sold it at a massive loss to a developer who, I later heard, demolished the whole thing to build new houses. I often wonder if they found anything strange when they dug up the foundations, or if the old tree, or whatever it was, simply let them. I still don't understand what was happening in that cellar. Was it some kind of unusual, aggressive plant, or something else? That specialist's words still echo in my mind. This one is deep. Sometimes, when I walk on soft earth, or smell damp soil after rain, I get a chill, and I can't help but think of those pale green saplings, persistently, unnaturally, growing in the dark, cold earth beneath that old farmhouse, reaching for something, reaching for us. This happened a few years back when I was about 15. My best friend Leo lived a couple of streets over, but there was a large, old, and mostly untended apple orchard that sat between our housing developments. Going around it by road took a good 20 minutes, but there was a faint dirt path that cut straight through the orchard, which could get you from his back gate to near my street in less than 10. We called it the orchard path. The orchard itself was a bit creepy, even in daylight. The apple trees were old and gnarled, many of them leaning at odd angles, their branches tangled together like arthritic fingers. It wasn't regularly maintained, so the grass was long and thorny bushes grew wild in patches. Most of the apples that fell just rotted on the ground, giving the air a faintly sweet, sometimes fermented smell, especially in late summer. Local kids sometimes dared each other to go in there at night, but mostly, it was just a quicker way to get from A to B if you weren't easily spooked. Leo and I had used the path a few times during the day without any issue. It was just an orchard, but one evening we were at his place, working on a school project, and lost track of time. It was already getting dark, around 8:30 p.m., when I realized I needed to head home for dinner. "Just cut through the orchard," Leo suggested. "It's quicker." I hesitated. I'd never used it after dusk before. "Isn't it kinda dark in there?" "Nah, it's fine," he said, probably trying to sound braver than he felt. "There's still a bit of light. Plus, what's going to happen? A rogue apple fall on your head?" So I agreed. We said goodbye, and I headed to his back gate that opened almost directly onto the path. As I stepped into the orchard, The last bit of sunlight was filtering through the leaves, creating long, dancing shadows. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the usual neighborhood sounds, distant traffic, dogs barking, faded away, replaced by a heavy silence. It wasn't completely quiet. I could hear the crunch of my own footsteps on the dry leaves and twigs, and the occasional rustle in the undergrowth, which I told myself was just squirrels or rabbits. The path was narrow, and the trees pressed in close on either side. Their branches, laden with leaves and the occasional small green apple, seemed to reach out. I started to walk a bit faster. That feeling of being watched, which I often dismissed, was stronger here, in the fading light. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. About halfway through, I heard a distinct rustling in the trees to my right, too loud to be a squirrel. It sounded like something larger moving through the leaves, keeping pace with me but just out of sight. My heart started to beat a little faster. "It's probably just a deer," I muttered to myself, trying to stay calm. The rustling stopped when I stopped, and started again when I moved. I picked up my pace, almost jogging the rest of the way. When I finally emerged from the other side of the orchard, onto the familiar street near my house, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I looked back, but the orchard entrance just looked dark and still. I told Leo about it the next day, and he laughed. "Dude, you're just getting spooked by an old orchard. It was probably a raccoon." I tried to believe him, but the feeling had been too specific, too much like I was being followed. A couple of weeks later, I was at Leo's again, this time with another friend, Maya. We were hanging out, and again it got late. Leo's parents were out, and they weren't due back for another hour. Maya needed to get home, and her house was in the same direction as mine. "Let's take the orchard path," Leo said, with a bit of a dare in his voice, looking at me. "Unless Danny's too scared." I didn't want to look like a coward in front of Maya, so I agreed, trying to sound casual. "Sure, why not?" This time, it was fully dark. We all had our phone flashlights on. The orchard seemed even more oppressive at night. The gnarled trees looked like grotesque figures in the narrow beams of our lights. The sweet, rotting apple smell was stronger. Almost immediately, I got that same feeling of being watched, but more intense. Leo and Maya were talking and laughing, trying to act brave, but I noticed their voices were a little too loud, their laughs a little too forced. We were about a third of the way through when Maya suddenly stopped. "Guys, did you smell that?" "Smell what? The rotten apples?" Leo asked. "No," she said, her voice low. "Something else, really sweet, like perfume, but old." I sniffed the air. I could smell it too, faintly. A cloying, overly sweet fragrance mixed with the damp earth and decaying fruit. It wasn't pleasant. "Probably just some weird flower," I said, though I didn't believe it. We kept walking, a little closer together now. The rustling sounds started again, this time on both sides of the path. It was definitely something keeping pace with us. Leo tried to shine his flashlight into the trees, but the darkness between the trunks was too deep. The light just seemed to get swallowed up. Then, we saw something on the path ahead, in the combined beam of our flashlights. It was a single, perfectly ripe red apple. It looked completely out of place among the green, unripe apples still on the trees and the rotting ones on the ground. It was sitting right in the middle of the path, as if it had been carefully placed there. None of us said anything. We just stared at it for a moment, then carefully walked around it. The sweet, perfume-like smell was stronger near the apple. We hurried the rest of the way, the rustling in the trees following us, until we burst out of the orchard. We were all breathing heavily. "Okay, that was weird," Leo admitted, his usual bravado gone. Maya just nodded, her face pale. We walked Maya home, then Leo walked with me to my door, neither of us wanting to be alone. I avoided the orchard path for a long time after that. But about a month later, I found myself in a situation where I had no choice. I'd stayed late at school for a club meeting, missed the last bus, and my parents weren't home to pick me up. It was either a very long walk around by the main roads or the orchard path. It was already past 10 p.m., and a light, drizzling rain had started. I figured the path would be quicker. I told myself the other times were just my imagination or animals. The orchard was pitch black. The rain made the leaves slick underfoot, and the air was heavy and cold. The perfume smell hit me as soon as I stepped onto the path, much stronger this time, almost suffocating. I had my phone flashlight out, but the beam seemed weak, unable to penetrate the dense darkness between the trees. I was only a few steps in when I heard it, not just rustling this time, but a definite heavy footstep on the path behind me. I froze. I spun around, shining my light down the path. Nothing, just the dark, wet trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No reply. I told myself it was an echo or an animal. I started walking again, faster this time. Crunch. Another footstep, closer. I started to run. I could hear the footsteps behind me, running too. Heavy and deliberate, splashing in the puddles. They were gaining on me. I didn't dare look back. Then I heard a sound that wasn't footsteps. It was a low, guttural breathing, very close behind me, and a twig snapped right next to my ear, as if something had reached out for me. I screamed, a choked, terrified sound, and ran as fast as I possibly could, not caring about the slick path or the branches whipping at my face. I could still hear the heavy breathing and the thudding footsteps pursuing me. I burst out of the orchard and onto the street, gasping for breath, and didn't stop running until I reached my front door. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and finally got inside, slamming and locking the door. I stood there, panting, my back against the door, for a long time. I never took the orchard path again, day or night. Leo and Maya didn't either. We heard some vague local stories later about how the old orchard was supposedly on unhallowed ground, or how people sometimes got lost in there and came out different, but no one ever had any concrete details. I still don't know what was in that orchard with us. I never saw anything clearly, just the feeling of being watched, the rustling, the strange smell, and finally the pursuit. Sometimes, when I smell ripe apples or a certain kind of cloyingly sweet perfume, a chill runs down my spine, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened if it had caught me on that dark, rainy night. Whatever it was, I'm certain it wasn't an animal, and it definitely wasn't friendly. It felt old and patient and hungry. It was around 4 a.m. on a Saturday when I was heading to work, cruising down the highway. I was in the center lane and driving a bit faster than usual since I was already running a little late. That's when I spotted a vehicle in my left side mirror, gaining on me rapidly. It caught me off guard, because I was already doing about 75 or 80 miles per hour. So for it to be closing in that fast, it had to be going at least 90, maybe closer to 100. The car flew up next to me, a silver two-door coupe, and naturally I glanced over to see who was inside. Even though it was still dark out, I could make out the driver looking right at me as he passed. That's when I noticed someone else in the back seat, a young woman, and she was hitting the rear window repeatedly. At first I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me figured maybe she was just playing around, or being dramatic. You don't immediately assume something serious is going on, but then I saw the driver reach back and forcefully push her down out of sight, all while swerving slightly. That's when I realized something wasn't right. This girl was trying to signal for help. I sped up and pulled in behind them to keep them in sight. From there I could see the man in the driver's seat turning around and striking into the back seat repeatedly. Her arms were flailing. There was no doubt in my mind I was watching an assault happen in real time. I was stunned. I couldn't believe I was witnessing what looked like an actual abduction unfolding in front of me. While staying behind them, keeping up with their 95-mile-per-hour pace, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. As I was talking to the dispatcher, the car ahead suddenly slowed down. The brake lights came on, and it began to decelerate to a stop, He had noticed I was tailing him and must have realized I'd seen too much. I wanted to help, but I had no way of knowing if the guy was armed, so instead of stopping, I veered around him and hit the gas. Still wanting to keep track of the situation, I took the next off-ramp, but didn't go all the way up. I waited there on the shoulder, watched as the car sped past me on the highway, then cut across the grassy median to get back on the road, and follow again, still on the line with emergency services. I was going well over 90 to catch back up. As I started to close the distance, he must have spotted me again, because he suddenly began braking, clearly trying to block me. I attempted to pass, but he swerved and cut me off. I had to hit the brakes hard. That's when he jumped out of his vehicle and started charging toward me, holding something in his hand. Panicking, I threw my car into reverse and backed up fast until he stopped coming at me. As soon as he turned around, I shifted back into drive and sped past him before he could get back into his car. The 911 dispatcher told me that a state trooper was nearby ahead and instructed me to keep going until I passed them. I was still being chased. He was flying down the road right behind me at dangerously high speeds. Then finally, I saw flashing red and blue lights in my rearview mirror right behind him. The cruiser got in position with me in front, and the guy in the car behind me. He had no room to move, and he pulled over onto the grass shoulder. I stopped too, but kept a safe distance 2 car lengths between us just in case. The trooper stepped out with his weapon drawn and ordered him out of the vehicle. I got out as well and watched it happen. The man ended up face down on the ground, handcuffed. A second patrol car arrived shortly after. One of the officers went over to the car and opened the rear door. The woman climbed out, visibly bruised, sobbing, but clearly relieved. She kept thanking me over and over, saying I saved her life. Turns out the driver was her former boyfriend. He had shown up at her place uninvited, and when she refused to talk to him, he became violent, dragged her to his car, and locked her in the back using child locks. It still rattles me to think about where he might have been headed with her, or what he had planned if no one had seen her pounding on that window and done something about it. I was on my way to visit some family in Cambridge to cheer on a relative who was running in the city marathon. I had decided to drive out from Milwaukee to Massachusetts, and most of the route would follow Highway 21, of the longest stretches of road in the country. I've never been much of a fan of flying, so I chose to hit the road after work, leaving around 3 p.m. My GPS estimated it would be a 15-hour haul, but knowing how I tend to drive, I figured I could shave an hour off and roll in around 5 a.m. I don't really like stopping much when I'm on long drives. I usually prefer to just power through and get to the destination in one continuous trip. A large chunk of Route 20 passes through open plains and quiet, low-traffic areas. By about 1 a.m., close to 10 hours in, I was practically the only vehicle in sight. I had the music cranked to keep myself alert, and while I was definitely starting to feel drowsy, even with 2 coffees in me, I didn't want to pull over for another. I figured the payoff of collapsing into a bed later would be worth the grind now. Out of nowhere, just when it seemed like I had the road to myself, I noticed a set of headlights in the rearview mirror. I was cruising in the left lane when this vehicle started tailing me closely. To be courteous, I merged over to the right lane so he could pass. He did briefly, but then slowed down and maintained his position just ahead of me, lining his rear bumper up with my front bumper. He kept pace with me for a while like that. Eventually, I tried to accelerate and move past him, but as soon as I got ahead, he merged back into my lane and rode right up on my bumper so close it looked like he might actually hit me. Not wanting to get into any kind of altercation on the road, especially not this late, I pressed the gas a little more, trying to create distance, but he matched my speed. When I switched back into the left lane, he mirrored the move. At that point, I knew something was off. It clearly wasn't law enforcement. The truck was an old, beat-up pickup, not any sort of official vehicle. Then the driver started flashing his high beams at me. I didn't slow down. I was honestly kind of shaken. Nothing like this had ever happened to me before while driving. I tried easing the car faster, maybe 5 or 10 miles per hour more, hoping I'd pass a police car or even just any other driver. but the road was completely empty on my side, and only a few cars sped by in the opposite direction. Suddenly, the truck changed lanes again and gunned it. The sound of its engine roaring as it flew past me, it swerved back in front of me and began hitting the brakes hard. I tried to go around, but every time I shifted lanes, he blocked me. I had no choice but to brake as well. I leaned on the horn, not knowing what else to do. Then the driver flicked on the hazard lights and started motioning for me to pull over, sticking his arm out the window and waving it toward the side of the road. There was no way I was going to do that. Instead, I seized the moment when he veered slightly onto the shoulder and shot past him. I floored it. My sedan had a good bit of speed, and I was hopeful I could leave him behind. I pushed the car to 100 miles per hour, but even then he was still chasing me. I took the next exit off the highway, not really thinking, just reacting. At the end of the ramp, I came to a red light, assuming by now he'd be gone. But then the headlights appeared again. The truck pulled up right next to me at the light. I glanced to the left and saw the window slowly rolling down. Inside were 3 people, probably men, wearing Guy Fawkes-style masks. They just stared at me silently. I couldn't tell what they wanted, but whatever it was, I wanted no part of it. The sight alone was enough to send a chill through my chest. I ran the red light and turned onto the main road. Thankfully, there were other cars around now. A short while later, the truck finally stopped following me. I don't know what their intentions were, but it clearly wasn't just some case of irritated driving. It felt a lot more threatening than that. I never caught the license plate, if there even was one, and all I remember is it was a black pickup from the 90s, nothing fancy. I ended up pulling into a Walmart parking lot and sleeping for a few hours. Around 8 a.m., I got back on the road and finished the trip. When I got to my family's place, I told them the whole story. Now I always warn people to be extra careful driving alone late at night, especially through remote areas. You never know who else might be out there. It was a Tuesday night in early March, and I was on my way home after spending the evening at a friend's place in the city. The drive would normally take about an hour if the weather cooperated, but a thick fog had rolled in, blanketing the remote highway in a heavy gray mist just after midnight. This particular road was usually deserted at that hour, aside from the occasional semi-truck rolling through, often bearing license plates from states I'd never even visited. By 1 a.m., I was exhausted. Hours of walking around town, browsing shops, and cafe hopping with friends had left me worn down. My eyes were growing heavy, and the endless fog made everything ahead blur together, turning the road into a featureless wash of dull gray. I was being cautious, easing off the gas at times and keeping my hazard lights on so that any car behind me would know I was there. Out of nowhere, a car came into view, stopped oddly, with 2 tires on the pavement and 2 on the shoulder. I slammed the brakes and just managed to steer around the rear bumper, my heart pounding from the sudden scare. Shaken, I put my car in park a short distance behind the vehicle to calm down. It was a dark-colored sedan, and as I watched it, slowly shifted fully off the road onto the shoulder. A few seconds later, the driver's side window rolled down, and an arm extended out, motioning as if to signal me to pull over. I was still tense from the near miss, and in the moment it seemed reasonable to reposition my car more securely on the side. The sedan took a soft turn off the main road onto a narrow side lane and came to a stop. The driver's door opened and a tall, thin man stepped out, walking toward me through the haze. He looked like he was in his early 30s, wearing jeans and a black winter coat. As he came closer, my headlights lit up his face, revealing a smile. I cracked my window just slightly, assuming maybe he was about to apologize for parking the way he had. Once he reached my door, he gestured for me to roll the window down further. I shook my head and told him I could still hear him fine. He asked where I was headed, and I replied that I was going home. He mentioned that the fog was supposed to stay thick all night, and said it wasn't safe to keep driving in it. I let him know I was comfortable driving in fog and planned to continue. Then he asked, raising an eyebrow, why I'd pulled over if I was fine to drive. Not wanting to escalate anything, I quickly made up a lie and said I had gotten a phone call and had to stop for a second. He smiled again, but it was different this time. like he knew I was lying. Then he said he lived just a few minutes down the road with his wife and kid, and offered for me to wait out the fog at their place. I declined again. Still, he didn't drop it. He began throwing out statistics about how fog increases the chance of fatal crashes, told me I looked tired, and said I should think about my loved ones before making a risky decision. I stayed firm. That's when the tone changed. His face hardened, and he kept glancing back toward his car. I noticed a movement in the passenger seat. Someone else was in there, though I hadn't seen them before. Suddenly the man reached for my door handle and tried to open it. Thank God I had it locked. At that moment, the passenger door of his car flew open, and another man jumped out, sprinting toward me holding a baseball bat. I didn't waste another second. I slammed the car into reverse as the first man shouted something to his partner. The guy with the bat swung at my vehicle but missed just barely. My heart was racing. I hadn't pulled too far from the main road, but in the thick fog it was hard to judge exactly where the side lane met the highway. I spun my wheel, threw the car into drive, and prayed there was no oncoming traffic as I merged back onto the main road as fast as I could. I didn't look back once. Even now, whenever I find myself driving that same stretch of highway, I can't help but wonder if those two men tried to target anyone else that night. And I still think about what might have happened if I'd rolled my window down a bit more. Bad things can happen on the road after dark. Late hours tend to bring out some of the most unsettling situations and odd individuals, so it's important to stay cautious. This took place back in 2020, right around when the pandemic first started. I was working irregular overnight shifts at a medical center. My schedule changed constantly. I always took the same route home, a parkway that ran about 10 miles north to my neighborhood. It was never particularly busy, even during daylight hours, and late at night it was often completely deserted. The early COVID days only made it feel more empty. I rarely saw patrol cars out that late either. Normally this worked to my advantage, letting me cruise home quickly without slow drivers in my way. This one particular night, I was heading home in the very early morning hours. As I was driving, I noticed a red emergency-style light flashing by the shoulder up ahead. It lit up the back of a vehicle parked off to the side. Someone clearly needed help. I was in a decent mood and figured I'd stop to see if I could lend a hand. As I passed the car, I saw a man waving both arms to flag someone down. I pulled over ahead of his vehicle, put on my hazard lights, and stepped out to approach him. Judging by his skin tone and faint accent, I'd say he was Latino. His face was covered with a mask, so I couldn't get a good read on his age, but if I had to guess, he was somewhere around his late 20s or early 30s. I asked what the issue was. He told me his battery died after being parked too long. I asked if he had jumper cables since I didn't. He said no. I wasn't sure how else I could really help besides maybe offering him a ride. Then he asked if he could borrow my phone, claiming his had died as well. I didn't love the idea of handing my unlocked phone to a stranger, but I did. I unlocked it and opened the dialer for him. He took it and began walking a few steps away while starting to talk. His car door was still open, and without really thinking, I stepped into the front seat to try starting it myself. To my surprise, the keys were still in the ignition. I turned the key halfway, and the electronics turned on. The hazards blinked, the radio worked. Curious, I turned the key again to see if the engine would start, and it did instantly. I didn't even have time to process what was going on before I suddenly felt arms wrapping tightly around my neck from the back seat. Someone was trying to strangle me. I heard the man who had borrowed my phone yelling, "Hey! Hey!" As he rushed back toward the car, I managed to wriggle free pretty quickly. I turned and saw a teenager sitting behind me. He was the one who had grabbed me. The man with my phone came running, shouting something at the teen. I didn't wait around to hear the rest. I bolted back to my own vehicle and started the engine. Just as I sped away, I heard a loud pop sound from somewhere outside. A few minutes later, I found out that sound had been a gunshot. My rear windshield had been shattered, a visible hole in the center, with spiderweb cracks radiating outward. I couldn't call the police right away because my phone was still with the guy. Once I got home, I immediately told my parents. Then I grabbed the house phone and called emergency services. I told them the whole story, how it was clearly a setup, how someone had been hiding in the back seat, and how the guy still had my phone with full access to everything on it. The police suggested I contact my service provider, Orion Wireless, and request a record of any outgoing calls from the last hour, but the provider's support line didn't open until 7 a.m., so I had to wait. In the meantime, I used my dad's phone to activate Find My Device and remotely lock my phone. I hoped I did that before they could pull up my saved home address. At 7 a.m., I called the carrier and asked if they could look up the most recent outgoing call. The only one recorded was from the day before a short call to my mom while I was at work. That meant the man never actually made a call at all, and it got worse. All of the cryptocurrency I'd been holding in my exchange wallet worth several $1,000s was drained and transferred to some anonymous digital address, untraceable. The phone stopped showing location data shortly afterward, either turned off or destroyed. I never got it back. About a week later, I was woken up by my mom's voice, clearly alarmed. My dad was knocking on my bedroom door, telling me to come outside. Nervous, I followed. He explained that he and my mom had heard noises coming from our backyard, but when we checked, there was nothing. My mom wanted to call the authorities again, but my dad said we should wait and see if we heard anything else. Nothing else happened that night. I don't know if someone really was back there, but if it was that same man, I hate to think what might have happened. It's been over 2 years since then, so it's probably behind me now, but I'll never stop on the highway for a stranger at night again. Not after that.